Picture this: a quiet September night in 1961. An interracial couple drives home through New Hampshire's White Mountains after a long-delayed honeymoon. The road is empty, the sky clear. Not just any light, something that seems to follow them, growing brighter with each passing mile. What happens next would change everything, not just for Barney and Betty Hill, but for how America thinks about visitors from beyond our world. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy exploring mysteries with us. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see listeners joining from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The autumn air hung crisp that September night in 1961, carrying the scent of dying leaves through New Hampshire's White Mountains. Route 3 stretched empty ahead of them, a ribbon of asphalt winding between towering peaks that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Betty Hill gazed out the passenger window at the familiar landscape sliding past, her hand resting gently on the dashboard of their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. Picture this moment: a hard-working couple finally stealing away for 3 precious days together after 16 months of marriage. Betty, a social worker for the New Hampshire Department of Health and Welfare, dealing daily with child welfare cases that would break most people's hearts. Barney, a postal worker making the brutal 60-mile commute to Boston every day, working night shifts that left him perpetually exhausted. Both of them active in their Unitarian church, both members of the NAACP, quietly fighting for civil rights in a predominantly white state. Their marriage itself was an act of quiet courage. In 1961, interracial couples faced challenges that most people never had to consider. Not that their friends and family weren't supportive, but there were the looks from strangers, the whispered comments, the occasional outright hostility. They had learned to navigate these waters together, finding strength in their shared commitment to justice and their deep love for each other. The dashboard clock glowed 10:15. They should be home in Portsmouth by 2 in the morning at their current pace. Montreal had been everything they had hoped for, with its European charm and excellent food. Niagara Falls had left them both speechless. For 3 wonderful days, they had been just another couple on vacation, free from the pressures of work and the subtle tensions of their daily lives. Betty's eyelids felt heavy as the car's gentle motion lulled her toward sleep. The mountains created a cocoon around them, and she felt that particular peace that comes from being completely alone with the person you love most. The radio played softly, filling the comfortable silence between them. No deadlines, no crisis cases, no night shifts. Just the 2 of them and the quiet road home. That's when she noticed the light. At first, it seemed unremarkable. A bright point moving through the sky. Probably a satellite or perhaps a military aircraft from nearby Pease Air Force Base. The space race was in full swing, after all. The Soviets had launched Sputnik just a few years earlier, and the skies were increasingly busy with man-made objects. But as Betty watched, something about its movement seemed wrong. It appeared to be following a path roughly parallel to Route 3, keeping pace with their car in a way that satellites simply don't do. "Barney, do you see that light up there?" she said softly, not wanting to alarm him but curious about what she was seeing. He glanced up through the windshield, following her gaze. "Yeah, I see it. Probably just a satellite. They're launching all kinds of things these days." Betty continued watching as they drove. The light seemed brighter now, and its movement definitely wasn't following the predictable arc of a satellite crossing the sky. It was moving in ways that seemed to mirror their progress along the winding mountain road, adjusting its course as they navigated the curves. "It's been following us for a while now," she said, trying to keep her voice casual despite a growing sense of unease. Barney was a practical man, a World War II veteran who had seen his share of aircraft both friendly and hostile. He understood how planes moved through the sky, knew their sounds and their lights. This didn't behave like anything in his experience, but military bases often tested new equipment in ways that might confuse civilians. Could be some kind of military exercise, he suggested, though his own voice carried a note of uncertainty. You know how they're always testing new things with all the bases around here. But as they continued driving south through the mountains, the light seemed to grow not just brighter but more purposeful. What had started as a distant curiosity was becoming an active presence in their night. Other cars were nowhere to be seen on Route 3. The hills were completely alone with whatever this thing was, and it seemed to be taking a very specific interest in their journey home. The light would disappear behind the tree line as they rounded curves, only to reappear moments later in exactly the position you'd expect if it were deliberately tracking their movement. When they slowed down for tighter turns, it seemed to adjust accordingly. When they picked up speed on straighter stretches, it kept pace effortlessly. Betty felt the first flutter of real anxiety creeping up her spine. This wasn't random. This wasn't some distant satellite following its predetermined orbit. The light was definitely tracking their movement, staying with them as they navigated the twisting mountain road with an intentionality that felt almost predatory. "Barney, I think we need to pull over and get a better look at this thing." He had been thinking the same thing. Whatever was up there deserved more than casual glances through the windshield while trying to drive. If it was military equipment, they should be able to identify it properly. If it was something else, well, they needed to know what they were dealing with. The practical part of his mind suggested it had to be conventional aircraft, but the growing knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. In all his years of military service, all his experience around airfields and aircraft, he had never seen anything move the way this light was moving. Near Lancaster, where Route 3 straightened out briefly, Barney spotted a wider section of road where they could safely stop without blocking traffic. Not that there was any traffic to block at this hour. He pulled the Chevrolet over onto the gravel shoulder and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt profound after hours of driving. The gentle ticking of the cooling engine mixed with the distant sound of wind moving through the pine trees. Above them, the light hung motionless now, as if it too had stopped to observe this roadside encounter. It was bigger than they had realized from inside the moving car. Much bigger, and closer than anything should be if it were flying at normal aircraft altitudes. Betty reached into the back seat for the binoculars they always kept for bird watching, while Barney opened his door and stepped out into the cool night air. The light pulsed gently, not like the steady navigation lights of conventional aircraft, but with an organic rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. As Barney stood beside their car, looking up at this impossible thing hanging in the New Hampshire sky, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the world, about themselves, and about humanity's place in the vast cosmic darkness that surrounded their small blue planet. The gravel crunched under Barney's feet as he stepped away from the car, his eyes fixed on the object hovering silently above them. Betty handed him the binoculars through the open driver's window, her own gaze never leaving the pulsing light that seemed to have grown even brighter since they stopped. "Take the pistol too," she whispered, nodding toward the glove compartment where Barney kept his .38 caliber revolver. As a black man traveling through rural New England in 1961, Barney had learned the wisdom of being prepared for trouble, though he had never imagined trouble might come from the sky. The weight of the gun felt reassuring in his jacket pocket as he raised the binoculars to his eyes. What he saw through the lenses made his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't an airplane, wasn't a helicopter, wasn't anything in his vocabulary of flying objects. The craft was massive, perhaps 40 feet across, and flat like a pancake with rows of windows wrapped around its circumference. Behind those windows, silhouetted against a soft interior glow, figures moved with deliberate purpose. The beings appeared humanoid but wrong somehow, their proportions unsettling in ways his mind struggled to process. They wore what looked like uniforms, dark and close-fitting, and they seemed to be looking directly back at him. As this realization hit him, one of the figures moved closer to a window, and Barney found himself staring into eyes unlike anything he had ever seen. They were enormous, wrapping around the sides of the creature's head, dark and depthless, and filled with an intelligence that felt utterly alien. The being tilted its oversized head slightly, as if studying this human who dared to study it in return. Then, impossibly, Barney heard a voice inside his mind, clear as if someone were standing beside him. "Stay where you are and keep looking." The telepathic command sent ice through his veins. His hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but his arm felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the air itself had thickened around him. The beings in the craft continued their observations, and he could sense their clinical interest, their complete lack of emotion as they regarded him like a specimen under examination. Terror finally overcame paralysis. "We're going to be captured," he thought with sudden, overwhelming certainty. These things, whatever they were, had been following them for a reason, and that reason was becoming horrifyingly clear. He turned and ran back toward the car, stumbling over the rough ground, the binoculars bouncing against his chest. "Betty, we've got to get out of here," he gasped as he threw himself behind the steering wheel. His hands shook as he turned the ignition, the engine seeming to take forever to catch. "Go, go, go," he muttered under his breath, pressing the accelerator harder than necessary as they pulled back onto Route 3. But Betty was leaning out the passenger window, craning her neck to keep the craft in sight as it began to move again. "It's following us," she called over the rush of wind. "It's right above us now." Barney could see the glow reflecting off the road ahead, could feel some indefinable presence pressing down on them from above. The craft seemed to be descending, getting closer, though it maintained its eerie silence. No engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing but the whisper of displaced air that he felt rather than heard. Then came the sounds from their trunk, rhythmic beeping, like some kind of electronic signal emanating from the back of their car. The noise was unlike anything either of them had heard before, metallic and urgent, as if their Chevrolet had suddenly grown some alien appendage that was calling out to its masters overhead. "What is that?" Betty asked, her voice tight with fear for the first time that night. "I don't know," Barney replied, but even as he spoke, a strange drowsiness was beginning to creep over him. His eyelids felt heavy, his reflexes sluggish, as if he were fighting against some invisible sedative flooding through his system. The beeping continued, steady and hypnotic, and Betty was experiencing the same overwhelming urge to sleep. The last thing Barney remembered clearly was the struggle to keep his eyes open, to maintain control of the car, as consciousness slipped away from him like water through his fingers. The craft's glow seemed to intensify, filling their vision with a soft, enveloping light that made everything else fade to insignificance. When awareness returned, they were 35 miles further south on Route 3, near Ashland, with no memory of how they had gotten there. The beeping had stopped. The sky was empty except for stars. Their car was moving at normal speed down the familiar highway as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had happened. Barney's first coherent thought was that they had lost time, somehow, somewhere. The dashboard clock read 2:30 in the morning, but they should have been home in Portsmouth by now if they had simply driven straight through. Instead, they were still an hour away from home, with a gap in their memories that neither could explain. Betty looked at her watch and found it had stopped. So had Barney's. Both timepieces showed the same time, as if whatever had affected them had affected their personal belongings as well. The synchronicity was unsettling, suggesting that their experience, whatever it had been, was more than just a shared hallucination or moment of highway hypnosis. They drove the rest of the way home in relative silence, each lost in private thoughts about what might have occurred during those missing hours. The familiar streets of Portsmouth had never looked so welcoming, and their modest house felt like a sanctuary as they finally pulled into the driveway. But even home didn't provide the comfort they sought. As they unloaded their luggage, they discovered additional mysteries. Strange, shiny circles had appeared on the trunk of their car, perfectly round marks that hadn't been there before. When Betty held her compass near these spots, the needle spun wildly, as if the metal itself had been magnetized by some unknown force. Barney's shoes bore scuff marks on the tops, worn areas that made no sense given how he had been walking. Betty's dress was torn in several places and dusted with a pink powder. Neither of them could identify. Their binoculars, which had been hanging around Barney's neck during his terrifying observation of the craft, now had a broken strap, as if they had been yanked free with considerable force. Most disturbing of all was the nagging sense that something important had happened during those lost hours, something their minds were actively working to suppress. As they prepared for bed, both felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on them like the memory of that silent craft hovering overhead. They had no idea that their lives had just been forever changed, or that their experience would eventually become the template for an entirely new kind of human encounter with the unknown. The morning sun streaming through their bedroom windows should have brought relief, should have made the previous night's events seem like nothing more than a shared nightmare brought on by exhaustion and unfamiliar mountain roads. Instead, Betty Hill woke with a sense of profound unease, as if some essential part of herself had been left behind on that dark highway. Barney was already up, examining his shoes in the bright kitchen light. The scuff marks on the tops were even more puzzling in daylight, worn smooth as if he had been dragged across rough surfaces. But when had that happened? His last clear memory was of running back to the car after seeing those impossible figures staring at him through the craft's windows. Betty joined him at the kitchen table, her torn dress spread out before them like evidence from a crime scene they couldn't remember. The pink powder brushed off easily enough, but left behind no clue about its origin or composition. She had worked in social services long enough to recognize the signs of trauma, even when the source remained mysterious. "We need to report this," she said finally, her voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. "Whatever happened to us up there, the military should know about it." Barney nodded reluctantly. His natural inclination was to keep private matters private, especially anything that might invite ridicule or unwanted attention. But the physical evidence was undeniable, and their lost time suggested something significant had occurred, something that might affect others traveling through the White Mountains. Betty spent the morning at the Portsmouth Library, researching everything she could find about unidentified flying objects. The National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena had documented hundreds of sightings across the country, many by credible witnesses, including military personnel and commercial pilots. She wasn't alone in having seen something unexplainable in the sky. That afternoon, she called Pease Air Force Base. To her surprise, the officer who took her call seemed genuinely interested in their experience, not dismissive as she had feared. Major Paul Henderson arranged to interview them both that evening, bringing along forms and recording equipment that suggested the military took such reports seriously. The interview lasted several hours. Henderson was thorough, professional, asking detailed questions about the timing, the craft's appearance, their route through the mountains. He seemed particularly interested in the physical traces they had discovered, the stopped watches, the marks on their car, Barney's damaged shoes. Interestingly, Henderson mentioned that they weren't the only ones to report unusual aerial activity in the White Mountains that night. Several other witnesses had called in sightings of strange lights, though none had experienced the close encounter the Hills described. The military was already investigating what they termed an unknown aerial phenomenon. "We'll classify your report as credible and unexplained," Henderson told them as he packed up his equipment. That was higher praise than either of them had expected. In the military's careful language, credible and unexplained was as close to validation as civilian witnesses could hope to receive. But validation didn't bring understanding. In the days following their report, Betty began experiencing vivid dreams, night after night, each one more detailed and disturbing than the last. She dreamed of being walked up a ramp into the interior of the craft, of being separated from Barney, of undergoing medical examination by the strange beings she had glimpsed through the binoculars. The dreams had a quality unlike normal sleep experiences. They felt more like memories struggling to surface, consistent in their details, sequential in their narrative. Betty began writing them down immediately upon waking, capturing every detail she could remember before they faded. Meanwhile, Barney was developing physical symptoms that concerned them both. His chronic ulcers worsened dramatically. His blood pressure climbed to dangerous levels despite medication. Most mysteriously, a perfect circle of warts appeared around his groin, requiring surgical removal. The dermatologist had never seen anything quite like the pattern, as if something had marked him in a way that defied medical explanation. Their relationship began showing strain as well. Betty's growing conviction that they had experienced something extraordinary clashed with Barney's desire to return to normal life. He supported her research and her need to understand what had happened, but he also craved the anonymity and routine they had enjoyed before that night on Route 3. They found themselves making compulsive return trips to the White Mountains, driving the same route, stopping at locations that seemed somehow significant, though they couldn't say why. Each journey left them more frustrated, as if they were searching for something that remained just beyond their conscious awareness. Friends at their Unitarian church offered support and listened with open minds as Betty shared their experience. The congregation was intellectually curious and spiritually progressive, not given to quick dismissal of unusual phenomena. Several members suggested that hypnosis might help them recover their missing memories. Betty researched hypnotherapy extensively, reading about its use in treating war trauma and repressed memories. The technique seemed promising, but she also understood the risks. False memories could be created as easily as real ones recovered. They would need to find someone with impeccable credentials and extensive experience. Dr. Duncan Stevens, a psychiatrist who had been treating Barney's anxiety, listened to their story with professional interest. While he made no judgment about the reality of their experience, he could see that their inability to remember those crucial hours was causing significant psychological distress. "I know someone who might be able to help," he told them during one session. Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston is one of the most respected hypnotherapists in New England. If anyone can help you recover those memories safely, it would be him. The referral felt like a lifeline. After months of uncertainty, physical symptoms, and psychological pressure, they finally had a path forward. Whether that path would lead to answers or simply deeper mysteries remained to be seen. As Betty made the appointment with Dr. Simon's office, she felt both hope and apprehension. Part of her desperately wanted to know what had happened during those missing hours, but another part whispered warnings about doors that, once opened, might never be closed again. Neither she nor Barney could have imagined that their sessions with Dr. Simon would create the foundation for an entirely new chapter in humanity's relationship with the unknown. The dreams began just 7 days after their encounter on Route 3, arriving with the regularity of an unwanted visitor who knows exactly when to call. Betty would fall asleep normally, drifting off beside Barney in their familiar bedroom, only to find herself standing once again on that dark mountain highway, watching the silent craft descend toward their car. But these weren't ordinary dreams, shifting and illogical the way most sleep experiences tend to be. These visions had the weight and consistency of memory, unfolding night after night with identical details, the same sequence of events, the same conversations. Betty had always been a vivid dreamer, but nothing in her experience compared to the relentless clarity of these nocturnal journeys. In the dreams, she and Barney were approached by several beings after their car had somehow been stopped. The creatures were shorter than humans, perhaps 4 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads and the enormous, wraparound eyes that had so terrified Barney during his brief observation through the binoculars. Their skin appeared grayish under the craft's soft illumination, and they moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. The beings communicated without speaking, their thoughts appearing directly in her mind with startling clarity. "Don't be afraid," they seemed to say, though their alien features made such reassurance difficult to accept. "We won't harm you. We're just curious about your kind." In her dreams, Betty and Barney were led up a ramp into the interior of the craft. The walls curved seamlessly, without visible joints or seams, as if the entire structure had been formed from a single piece of unknown material. The lighting emanated from the surfaces themselves, soft and even, casting no shadows despite its brightness. They were separated almost immediately, taken to different areas of the craft for what the beings explained were routine examinations. Betty found herself in a room with curved walls and a table that adjusted its height and configuration without any visible mechanism. Several beings gathered around her, their large eyes reflecting an intelligence that was undeniably real, undeniably non-human. The medical examination that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The beings seemed fascinated by human physiology, taking samples of her hair, skin, and fingernails with instruments that appeared to grow from their hands rather than being held in them. They were particularly interested in her aging process, asking through their telepathic communication why her hair changed color and why her skin developed lines and spots. The most traumatic part of the examination involved what the beings called a pregnancy test. A long needle, connected to some kind of organic-looking device, was inserted into her navel. The pain was excruciating, unlike anything Betty had ever felt, and she cried out in agony until the leader, a slightly taller being who seemed to direct the others, intervened. The leader placed what might have been a hand on her forehead, and the pain stopped instantly. He explained that Barney didn't have the same structure, so the test wasn't necessary for him. The casual way he mentioned her husband suggested they were conducting parallel examinations, a detail that would later prove significant when comparing their recovered memories. After the medical procedures, Betty found herself alone with the leader in what appeared to be a control room or navigation center. Her natural curiosity overcame her fear, and she began asking questions about their origin, their purpose, their technology. The leader seemed pleased by her interest, unusual among the specimens they had examined. When Betty asked where they came from, the leader gestured toward a wall, and a three-dimensional star map appeared in the space before them, not projected on the surface, but somehow existing in the air itself, showing dots of various sizes connected by lines. Some lines were solid, others broken or dashed. The solid lines represent our regular routes of travel, the leader explained. The broken lines show expeditions, journeys to places we visit less frequently. Betty studied the map intently, trying to memorize its patterns. "Which one is our sun?" she asked, hoping to understand their place of origin. The leader seemed amused by her question. "If you don't know where you are, the map won't help you," he replied. But Betty was determined to remember what she was seeing, convinced that this information might be crucial for understanding their visitors' intentions. The beings were preparing to return them to their car when Betty made a bold request. Could she take something with her? Some proof of this encounter that others might believe. The leader considered this, then handed her a book-like object, covered with symbols that meant nothing to her but seemed significant to him. However, as they prepared to leave, another being objected to this gift. An argument ensued, conducted in rapid thoughts that Betty could sense but not understand. Finally, the leader reluctantly took the book back, explaining that it was too dangerous to allow such evidence to remain with humans. "You won't remember this anyway," he told her as they walked back toward the exit. "We're going to make you forget, for your own protection and ours." But Betty was determined not to forget. "I will remember," she told him defiantly. "No matter what you do, I will remember this." The leader seemed genuinely surprised by her determination. Most humans, he implied, were content to have these experiences erased from their consciousness. Betty's insistence on remembering was unusual, perhaps unprecedented in their dealings with her species. As they returned her to the highway where Barney was waiting, still in a state of confused amnesia, Betty repeated her promise to herself. "I will remember. I will remember. Whatever they do to my mind, I will find a way to remember." The dreams ended the same way every night, with Betty and Barney back in their car, driving south on Route 3 with no conscious memory of what had just occurred. But something in her sleeping mind had refused to let go, holding on to these experiences with a tenacity that even alien technology couldn't completely erase. When Betty woke each morning, she immediately wrote down every detail she could recall, filling notebook after notebook with descriptions of the beings, their craft, their procedures, their star map. The consistency was remarkable. Night after night, the same sequence of events, the same conversations, the same precise details about technology and physiology that seemed far beyond her conscious knowledge. Barney watched his wife's obsession with growing concern. The dreams were clearly taking a toll on her sleep and her emotional well-being, but he couldn't deny that her descriptions had a quality of reality that disturbed him deeply, especially when she mentioned details about his own experience that she had no way of knowing through normal means. Were these really dreams? Or was Betty's subconscious mind somehow recovering memories that had been deliberately suppressed? The question would soon drive them to seek answers through the most controversial therapeutic technique of their time. The months following their encounter stretched into a blur of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. Betty's dreams continued with their relentless consistency, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that seemed too incredible to be real, yet too detailed to dismiss as mere fantasy. Meanwhile, Barney's physical symptoms worsened with each passing week, his body seemingly rebelling against experiences his conscious mind couldn't recall. The ring of warts around his groin had been removed surgically, but their perfect circular pattern haunted both of them. Dr. Matthews, the dermatologist who performed the procedure, had never seen anything quite like it. Warts typically appeared randomly, following no discernible pattern, but these had formed a precise circle, as if something had deliberately marked Barney in a way that defied medical explanation. His ulcers, which had been manageable before their mountain encounter, now flared with increasing frequency and intensity. His blood pressure climbed despite medication, and he developed a persistent anxiety that seemed to have no identifiable source. Conventional therapy helped somewhat, but Dr. Duncan Stevens recognized that his patient was grappling with something beyond typical stress-related disorders. Betty threw herself into research with the methodical approach she brought to her social work cases. She spent countless hours at the Portsmouth Library, reading everything available about unidentified flying objects and the people who claimed to have encountered them. The National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena had documented thousands of sightings across the country, many by highly credible witnesses including military personnel, commercial pilots, and scientists. What struck her most forcefully was how isolated each witness seemed to feel. Person after person described the same sense of being alone with an incomprehensible experience, of having no framework for understanding what had happened to them. The ridicule and skepticism that typically greeted such accounts only deepened their isolation, creating a community of silent witnesses afraid to speak publicly about their experiences. Betty began corresponding with other witnesses, carefully building a network of people who had seen things that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Many described lost time, physical traces, and the nagging sense that something important had been forgotten. But none reported the kind of detailed, consistent dreams that plagued her nights. Their Unitarian church provided a supportive environment for exploring these questions. The congregation was intellectually curious and spiritually open-minded, not given to quick dismissal of unusual phenomena. When Betty finally shared their story during a small group meeting, the response was thoughtful rather than skeptical. Reverend Michael Picard listened to their account with the same careful attention he brought to all pastoral counseling. While he made no judgment about the literal truth of their experience, he could see that their inability to understand what had happened was causing genuine suffering. The church, he suggested, was exactly the place to grapple with mysteries that transcended conventional explanation. It was through the church community that they first heard about Ben Sweat, a hypnotist who occasionally spoke to adult education groups about memory recovery and therapeutic techniques. Sweat had extensive experience helping people recall traumatic experiences, particularly veterans struggling with war-related amnesia. When Betty and Barney attended one of Sweat's presentations in September of 1963, exactly 2 years after their encounter, they were struck by his emphasis on the careful, professional application of hypnotic techniques. This wasn't stage hypnosis or amateur experimentation, but a legitimate therapeutic tool used by trained medical professionals. After the presentation, they approached Sweat privately, sharing a condensed version of their story and asking whether hypnosis might help them recover their missing memories. His response was both encouraging and cautionary. Hypnosis can indeed help recover suppressed memories, he told them, but it's not something to attempt casually. The mind sometimes suppresses traumatic experiences for good reason, and forcing those memories to surface without proper support can cause more harm than healing. You need someone with extensive training and experience, preferably a medical doctor who specializes in therapeutic hypnosis. Sweat's recommendation was unambiguous. They should seek help from Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston. Simon was one of New England's most respected psychiatrists, with particular expertise in hypnotherapy. He had extensive experience treating military personnel suffering from war-related trauma, using hypnosis to help them process experiences too terrible for conscious memory. The referral felt like a lifeline, but it also represented a significant commitment. Sessions with Dr. Simon would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally demanding. There was no guarantee that hypnosis would provide the answers they sought. And there was always the risk that recovered memories might be more traumatic than the original suppression. Barney was particularly hesitant about the process. His natural inclination was toward privacy, toward handling personal matters within the family rather than exposing them to professional scrutiny. The idea of having his most private thoughts and memories recorded by a stranger made him deeply uncomfortable, but his physical symptoms were becoming impossible to ignore. The anxiety attacks were increasing in frequency and intensity. His ulcers required stronger medication and dietary restrictions that affected his work performance. The mysterious warts had been removed, but their psychological impact lingered like a question mark carved into his flesh. Betty's determination was unwavering. The dreams showed no signs of stopping, and their consistent detail suggested they were more than simple nighttime fantasies. If these were recovered memories breaking through some kind of psychological barrier, then professional help might be their only path to understanding and healing. They spent weeks discussing the decision, weighing the potential benefits against the risks and costs. Friends and family offered support, but couldn't make the choice for them. This was a journey they would have to undertake together, trusting in Dr. Simon's expertise and their own commitment to discovering the truth about those missing hours. When Betty finally called Dr. Simon's office in November of 1963, her hands trembled as she dialed the number. The receptionist was professional and discreet, explaining the doctor's approach to therapeutic hypnosis and scheduling their initial consultation for December 14th. As they prepared for their first meeting with Dr. Simon, both Betty and Barney felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were about to embark on a journey into their own suppressed memories, guided by one of the most skilled hypnotherapists in the country. What they would find there, and how it would change their lives, remained to be seen. Neither could have imagined that their sessions would create the foundation for an entirely new understanding of human contact with non-human intelligence, or that their private quest for healing would eventually reshape how an entire culture thought about visitors from beyond the stars. The morning of February 22nd, 1964, dawned gray and cold over Boston, with the kind of penetrating chill that seems to seep through even the heaviest winter coats. Betty and Barney Hill made the familiar drive from Portsmouth to Dr. Benjamin Simon's office on Beacon Hill, a journey they had been making weekly since December, for preliminary sessions designed to familiarize them with the hypnotic process. Dr. Simon was a distinguished figure in Boston medical circles, a man whose reputation for scientific rigor was matched only by his compassion for patients struggling with traumatic memories. His office reflected his methodical approach, carefully organized, professionally furnished, with recording equipment that would capture every word spoken during their sessions. He had treated hundreds of military personnel suffering from war-related amnesia, using hypnosis to help them process experiences too terrible for conscious memory. Today would be different from their previous meetings. Today, Dr. Simon would attempt to guide Barney back to that night in September of 1961, back to the missing hours that had haunted them both for more than 2 years. Betty would wait in the outer office, while her husband journeyed alone into whatever memories lay buried beneath the surface of his conscious mind. The process began slowly, with Dr. Simon's calm, professional voice guiding Barney into a relaxed state. The tape recorder turned silently, capturing every word, every pause, every emotional response that would emerge over the next several hours. Neither doctor nor patient could have predicted that they were about to document the birth of modern alien abduction mythology. "Now, Barney," Dr. Simon said in his measured tone, "I want you to go back to that night in September. You and Betty are driving home from your vacation. Tell me what you remember, starting from when you left the restaurant in Vermont." Barney's voice, when he began speaking, had the distant quality of someone viewing events from far away. He described the drive through familiar territory, the comfortable conversation with his wife, the peaceful feeling of being together after their brief but wonderful honeymoon. His narrative was detailed and coherent, matching everything they had discussed in conscious sessions. But as he approached the moment when Betty first noticed the light in the sky, his voice began to change. The calm recitation became more tense, more immediate, as if he were reliving rather than simply remembering. He described the light's strange behavior, its apparent interest in their car, the growing sense that something unprecedented was happening to them. The breakthrough came when Dr. Simon guided him past the point where his conscious memory ended. Suddenly, Barney was describing events that neither he nor Betty had been able to recall. Being compelled to turn off Route 3 onto a dirt road, driving deeper into the woods until their car simply stopped running. "There are figures standing in the road," Barney said, his voice tight with fear. "6 of them, maybe 7. They're blocking our path. The engine just died, and I can't get it started again." Dr. Simon leaned forward, maintaining his professional composure despite the extraordinary nature of what he was hearing. "Tell me about these figures, Barney. What do they look like?" "They're not human," Barney whispered, and for the first time since beginning the session, his voice cracked with emotion. "They're smaller than us, maybe 4 feet tall, but their heads are too big, too round. And their eyes. Oh God, their eyes are enormous, like they wrap around their whole heads. They're looking right at me, right into me, and I can't move." The beings approached their car with what Barney described as confident purpose, as if this were a routine procedure they had performed many times before. 3 of them surrounded the vehicle while the others waited in the road. When they gestured for him to get out, he found himself unable to resist, though part of his mind screamed in terror. "Don't be afraid," they told him, the words appearing directly in his thoughts rather than being spoken aloud. "We're not going to hurt you. This is just a routine examination." But routine for whom and why remained unclear as Barney described, being led away from the car toward a ramp that extended from what he could only describe as a metallic craft. The structure was larger than he had initially realized, perhaps 60 feet in diameter. Sitting silently in a clearing that seemed too small to accommodate something of that size. The interior defied his ability to describe it adequately. Curved corridors with no visible seams or joints, walls that seemed to glow with their own soft light, rooms that appeared to change size and configuration based on some unknown need or purpose. He was separated from Betty almost immediately, taken to what appeared to be an examination room. The medical procedures that followed were unlike anything in his experience or imagination. The beings seemed genuinely curious about human physiology, taking samples of his skin and hair with instruments that appeared to be extensions of their own bodies rather than separate tools. They were particularly fascinated by his aging process, asking through their telepathic communication why his hair grew only in certain places and why his teeth could be removed. Throughout the examination, Barney maintained his description with remarkable consistency, providing details about the being's appearance, behavior, and apparent scientific methodology. They moved with fluid precision, communicated through direct thought transmission, and displayed a clinical detachment that was more disturbing than outright hostility. The most traumatic moment came when they focused their attention on his lower body, conducting examinations that left him feeling violated and powerless. The beings seemed to understand his distress, but were unmoved by it, treating his emotional responses as simply another aspect of human physiology to be documented and studied. "I felt like I was nothing to them," Barney told Dr. Simon, his voice breaking completely now. "Like I was just an animal they were studying. They had no understanding of what they were doing to me as a person, as a human being. I was just a specimen to them." Dr. Simon maintained his professional demeanor throughout these revelations, though privately he was struggling to understand what he was witnessing. The emotional authenticity of Barney's responses was undeniable. This was clearly not fabrication or conscious invention. But the content seemed to challenge everything he understood about reality and human psychology. When the examination was complete, Barney described being returned to the car where Betty was waiting. Though he had no memory of her own experiences during their separation, The beings gave them some kind of post-hypnotic suggestion that would suppress their memories of the encounter, then allowed them to drive away with no conscious recollection of what had occurred. As Dr. Simon brought Barney out of hypnosis, both doctor and patient were visibly shaken by what had emerged. The level of detail, the emotional authenticity, and the internal consistency of the account were unlike anything in Simon's extensive experience with recovered memories. But this was only the beginning. Betty's sessions, conducted separately to avoid any possibility of cross-contamination, would reveal remarkably similar experiences from her own perspective. The consistency between their accounts, despite being hypnotized separately, would challenge Dr. Simon's understanding of memory, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Neither of them could have known that they were documenting not just personal trauma, but the birth of a mythology that would reshape how humanity thought about its place in the cosmos. The most disturbing aspect of the Hills' recovered memories emerged during their separate descriptions of the medical examinations they claimed to have undergone. Dr. Simon, hypnotizing them individually to prevent any cross-contamination of memories, was struck by the remarkable consistency of their accounts, particularly regarding procedures that seemed to reflect a clinical, scientific approach to studying human physiology. Under hypnosis, Barney described being placed on a table that adjusted itself to accommodate his body without any visible mechanism. The beings gathered around him with what he could only characterize as professional curiosity, their enormous eyes reflecting an intelligence that was undeniably real, undeniably non-human. They moved with the fluid precision of experienced medical technicians, though their methods bore no resemblance to earthly medicine. The examination began with what appeared to be routine observations. The beings studied his skin closely, taking samples with instruments that seemed to grow from their hands rather than being held as separate tools. They were particularly fascinated by areas where his hair grew differently, running their elongated fingers through his scalp and beard, with a curiosity that reminded him uncomfortably of researchers studying laboratory animals. They seemed genuinely puzzled by certain aspects of human aging, asking through their telepathic communication why his hair changed color and texture in different areas of his body. When they discovered that his teeth were removable, their excitement was palpable. They spent considerable time examining his dental work, apparently amazed that humans would deliberately alter their bodies in such ways. But the most invasive procedures focused on his reproductive system. The beings conducted examinations that left Barney feeling violated and powerless, treating his emotional distress as simply another aspect of human psychology to be documented. They collected samples with a clinical efficiency that ignored his dignity as a conscious being, reducing him to a collection of biological functions to be catalogued and studied. Throughout this ordeal, one being seemed to serve as the leader or supervisor, observing the procedures while occasionally directing the other's activities. This figure was slightly taller than the rest, with what might have been markings or a different type of covering that distinguished his status. He watched Barney's reactions with particular interest, as if human emotional responses were as scientifically valuable as physical samples. Betty's examination, recovered through separate hypnosis sessions, revealed both similarities and significant differences. She too was placed on a self-adjusting table in a room with curved walls and sourceless lighting, but her interactions with the beings were more extensive, perhaps because of her naturally curious personality and her willingness to engage with them despite her fear. The medical procedures she described were more detailed and, in some respects, more traumatic. The beings seemed particularly interested in her reproductive system, conducting what they explained was a pregnancy test using methods that bore no resemblance to contemporary medical practice. A long needle, connected to some kind of organic-looking apparatus, was inserted into her navel, causing excruciating pain that made her cry out in agony. The leader, as she came to think of him, immediately intervened when he saw her distress. He placed what might have been a hand on her forehead, and the pain stopped instantly, as if he had somehow blocked the nerve signals causing her suffering. He explained that this test wasn't necessary for Barney because he didn't have the same internal structure, a casual reference to her husband that suggested they were conducting parallel examinations on both of them simultaneously. What made Betty's account particularly compelling was her detailed interaction with the leader after the medical procedures were completed. Unlike the other beings, who seemed focused purely on their scientific observations, the leader appeared genuinely interested in communication and cultural exchange. He responded to her questions about their origin and purpose, though his answers often raised more questions than they resolved. The being's apparent medical knowledge was both impressive and limited in ways that suggested they were studying humans from an external perspective, rather than possessing intimate familiarity with human physiology. They understood biological processes well enough to collect samples and conduct sophisticated tests, but they seemed genuinely puzzled by aspects of human aging, dental care, and emotional responses that any human doctor would take for granted. Their instruments defied description using terrestrial technology. Rather than mechanical devices, the beings seemed to employ tools that appeared organic, growing from their hands or materializing from thin air when needed. These implements conducted examinations that were more thorough than anything available in 1961 medical practice. Yet they operated according to principles that neither Barney nor Betty could understand or explain. The psychological impact of these examinations was profound for both witnesses. They described feeling reduced to laboratory specimens, studied by intelligences that viewed them with clinical detachment rather than empathy or malice. The beings weren't cruel, but they were utterly indifferent to human dignity, treating emotional distress as simply another biological response to be documented. Perhaps most disturbing was the apparent routine nature of these procedures. The beings moved with practiced efficiency, as if they had performed similar examinations many times before. Their equipment was ready, their methods established, their documentation systematic. This suggested that the Hill's experience wasn't unique, but part of a larger program of study involving multiple human subjects. The consistency between Barney and Betty's separate accounts of these examinations was remarkable. Despite being hypnotized individually, with no opportunity to hear each other's sessions, they described similar procedures, similar beings, and similar environments. Even their differences made logical sense given their different personalities and the somewhat different treatments they apparently received. Dr. Simon found himself grappling with accounts that challenged his understanding of memory, consciousness, and reality itself. The emotional authenticity was undeniable. The level of detail was extraordinary. The internal consistency was remarkable. But the content seemed to require accepting the existence of non-human intelligences, conducting systematic medical studies of human beings, a possibility that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. Were these recovered memories of genuine experiences, or were they elaborate fantasies created by minds trying to process incomprehensible trauma? The question would haunt Dr. Simon for the rest of his career, and it continues to challenge researchers and skeptics more than 60 years later. Of all the extraordinary details that emerged during Betty Hill's hypnosis sessions, none would prove more intriguing or controversial than her description of the star map shown to her by the leader. This single element of her recovered memories would eventually launch decades of astronomical investigation, spark heated debates in scientific circles, and permanently link the Hill's experience to a specific star system, nearly 40 light-years from Earth. Under Dr. Simon's careful guidance, Betty described being alone with the leader after her medical examination had been completed. Unlike the other beings, who seemed focused purely on their scientific observations, the leader appeared genuinely interested in communication and cultural exchange. When Betty, displaying the intellectual curiosity that defined her personality, asked where their visitors had come from, his response was both illuminating and mysterious. Instead of answering directly, the leader gestured toward a blank wall, and suddenly a three-dimensional map appeared in the space before them. Not projected onto a surface, Betty emphasized, but somehow existing in the air itself. A holographic display of stellar positions that seemed to hang in space with crystalline clarity. The map showed dots of various sizes connected by lines, some solid and bright, others broken or dashed. The solid lines represent our regular trade routes, the leader explained through the same telepathic communication they had used throughout her examination. The broken lines show expeditions, journeys we make to places we visit less frequently or for special purposes. Betty studied the map with intense concentration, her social worker's training and attention to detail, serving her well, even under these impossible circumstances. She counted approximately 15 stars, connected by the network of lines, with two larger dots that seemed to represent the most significant points in this cosmic transportation system. Fascinated by this glimpse into galactic geography, Betty asked the obvious question: which one represents our sun? Where does Earth fit into this stellar network? The leader seemed genuinely amused by her inquiry, a response that suggested humor might be a universal trait among intelligent species. "If you don't know where you are," he told her, "then this map won't help you understand where we come from." It was a cosmic catch-22 that frustrated Betty deeply. Here was potentially the most significant scientific information in human history, a roadmap to interstellar civilization, and it was useless without the very knowledge it might provide. But she was determined to remember what she was seeing, convinced that somehow, someone would be able to decode this stellar puzzle. Betty memorized the pattern as best she could, noting the relative positions of the stars, the connections between them, the apparent hierarchy indicated by the different line styles. When she asked why some routes were more important than others, the leader explained that the solid lines connected worlds with regular contact, established relationships, ongoing commerce or communication. The dashed lines represented exploration routes, paths to younger civilizations, or worlds that offered specific resources or scientific interest. The implication was staggering. Betty was looking at evidence of a galactic civilization, a network of worlds connected by regular interstellar travel, with Earth apparently representing a frontier destination worthy of scientific expeditions, but not yet integrated into their broader community. After her hypnosis sessions concluded, Betty made repeated attempts to recreate the star map, drawing it from multiple angles and perspectives, in an effort to capture the three-dimensional relationships she had observed. Her artistic skills were limited, but her memory of the pattern was remarkably consistent across multiple attempts. The same stars appeared in the same relative positions, connected by the same network of lines, forming a distinctive geometric pattern that seemed too specific to be imagination. For several years, Betty's star map remained an intriguing but unverifiable aspect of her story. Then, in 1968, an elementary school teacher, an amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish, read John Fuller's book about the Hill's experience and became fascinated by the possibility that Betty's map might correspond to actual stellar positions. Fish understood that if the map was genuine, it would represent astronomical knowledge that wasn't available to Betty Hill in 1961. Star distances and positions were known only for the nearest stellar neighbors, and even that information was constantly being refined as observational techniques improved. A hoaxer would have had no way to create a scientifically accurate star map showing the view from another stellar system. Working with painstaking dedication, Fish began constructing three-dimensional models of nearby star systems using thread and beads, calculating positions based on the most accurate distance measurements available in the 1969 Gliese catalog of nearby stars. She focused on sun-like stars, reasoning that any civilization advanced enough for interstellar travel would likely have evolved around stars similar to our own. The process was extraordinarily tedious. Fish had to consider not just the positions of nearby stars, but the three-dimensional perspective from which Betty might have viewed them. She created multiple models, viewing them from hundreds of different angles, searching for a match to Betty's distinctive pattern. After years of meticulous work, Fish made a remarkable discovery. Viewed from the perspective of Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system approximately 39 light-years from Earth, Betty's map appeared to match the positions of nearby sun-like stars with stunning accuracy. The correlation was so precise that it seemed impossible to attribute to coincidence. Fish's analysis suggested that Betty had somehow drawn an astronomically accurate map, showing the view from the Zeta Reticuli system toward our region of the galaxy. The stars she had connected corresponded to actual stellar positions, and the network of lines seemed to represent the most logical routes for interstellar travel, between stars capable of supporting life. The discovery created a sensation in both UFO research circles and the broader astronomical community. Here was potential proof that Betty Hill had been shown genuine extraterrestrial information, knowledge that couldn't have been fabricated or guessed in 1961. Zeta Reticuli became permanently associated with the Hills experience, entering UFO mythology as the presumed home system of the gray aliens. But the story didn't end with Fish's triumphant analysis. In the 1990s, more accurate stellar distance measurements from the European Hipparcos satellite mission revealed that some of the stars in Fish's interpretation were actually much farther away than previously thought. Some stars she had counted as likely to host life would have been excluded by her own criteria, while other stars she had discounted were now recognized as potential homes for living worlds. These new measurements undermined the statistical significance of Fish's match, and she eventually issued a public statement withdrawing her support for the Zeta Reticuli interpretation. The star map that had seemed to provide scientific validation for Betty's experience was revealed to be based on incomplete astronomical data, yet the mystery persists. Even with updated stellar positions and improved understanding of which stars might support life, no one has successfully created an alternative explanation for Betty's specific pattern. The map remains too precise to be dismissed as random invention, too inaccurate to be accepted as alien science. The star map continues to intrigue researchers and skeptics alike, representing either evidence of genuine extraterrestrial contact or one of the most remarkably detailed false memories in psychological literature. More than 60 years after Betty Hill first described seeing it, the cosmic geography she claimed to witness remains one of the most compelling and controversial aspects of America's first alien abduction story. Dr. Benjamin Simon found himself in an unprecedented position as the Hills hypnosis sessions drew to a close in June of 1964. As one of New England's most respected psychiatrists, with decades of experience treating war-related trauma, he had encountered virtually every form of psychological disorder and therapeutic challenge. But nothing in his extensive background had prepared him for the consistent, detailed, and emotionally authentic accounts that had emerged from Betty and Barney Hill's recovered memories. The professional dilemma was acute. Simon's training and scientific worldview demanded skepticism toward extraordinary claims, particularly those that seemed to violate established understanding of reality. Yet his recordings contained hours of testimony that challenged every conventional explanation he could devise. The Hills' emotional responses were genuine, their memories remarkably consistent, despite being recovered separately, and their accounts included specific details that seemed beyond their conscious knowledge or imagination. Simon had hypnotized Betty and Barney dozens of times over 6 months, always separately to prevent cross-contamination of memories. Yet their recovered memories aligned in ways that suggested either shared experience or an incredibly sophisticated form of psychological contamination. They described the same beings, the same spacecraft interior, the same sequence of events, even the same conversations, though from their different perspectives. The emotional authenticity was particularly compelling. Under hypnosis, Barney would break down in hysterical sobbing as he relived his terror at seeing the alien beings. His fear was visceral, immediate, the response of someone genuinely traumatized by incomprehensible experience. Betty's reactions were different but equally convincing, her curiosity and determination shining through, even as she described being subjected to painful medical procedures. Yet Simon's scientific training rebelled against accepting the literal truth of alien abduction. The implications were staggering and seemed to require abandoning fundamental assumptions about reality, human knowledge, and our place in the universe. If the Hills account was genuine, it would represent the most significant discovery in human history, proof that we are not alone and that other intelligences are actively studying our species. Simon developed what he believed was a more psychologically plausible explanation. In his professional opinion, Betty's recurring dreams had gradually contaminated Barney's memories through repeated discussion and shared anxiety. The initial sighting of unusual lights had genuinely traumatized both of them, creating a psychological need to understand what they had experienced. Betty's vivid dreams provided a narrative framework that both of them unconsciously adopted as their suppressed memories. This theory explained the consistency between their accounts without requiring belief in extraterrestrial contact. It also aligned with Simon's understanding of how traumatic memories could be processed, suppressed, and reconstructed by minds struggling to cope with incomprehensible experiences. The hypnosis sessions hadn't recovered genuine memories, in his view, but had given therapeutic narrative structure to shared psychological trauma. Simon was particularly concerned about the broader implications of their story becoming public. He understood that hypnotically recovered memories were often treated as absolute truth by both patients and the general public, despite the well-documented risks of false memory creation. The therapeutic value of the process lay in helping patients process their anxiety and trauma, not necessarily in uncovering historical facts. His professional notes reveal growing frustration with the Hills' absolute certainty about the literal truth of their recovered memories. Simon had successfully treated their anxiety and trauma symptoms, which was his primary therapeutic goal. But they remained convinced that they had experienced genuine alien abduction, interpreting their improved mental health as validation of their story's authenticity, rather than evidence of successful psychological treatment. The psychiatrist was particularly troubled by the racial and social dimensions of the case. Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in 1961 America, facing daily pressures and subtle hostilities that most people never had to consider. Simon wondered whether their alien encounter narrative might be a psychological manifestation of their real-world experiences with otherness, powerlessness, and being studied or judged by hostile forces. In this interpretation, the gray aliens represented a projection of their anxieties about social acceptance and belonging. The medical examinations reflected their daily experience of being scrutinized by a predominantly white society that saw their marriage as unnatural or threatening. The beings' clinical detachment mirrored the institutional racism that reduced them to sociological specimens rather than recognizing their full humanity. Simon's analysis suggested that the Hills' account, whether literally true or psychologically constructed, revealed profound insights about the African American experience in mid-20th century America. The narrative of being studied, categorized, and subjected to procedures they couldn't understand or control resonated with the systemic dehumanization that racial minorities faced throughout American society. Yet even Simon's sophisticated psychological analysis couldn't fully account for all aspects of the Hills' story. The star map that Betty described and later drew was particularly puzzling, containing astronomical details that seemed beyond her knowledge or cultural background. The technical descriptions of the spacecraft and its occupants showed remarkable consistency and specificity that challenged simple explanations of fantasy or wish fulfillment. Most troubling for Simon was his recognition that his successful treatment of the Hills' symptoms might inadvertently validate their belief in alien contact. They felt better, slept better, and functioned better after recovering their suppressed memories. If the therapeutic process had simply created elaborate false memories, why had it been so effective in treating their genuine psychological distress? The psychiatrist's final assessment, published in psychiatric journals and later interviews, reflected his professional uncertainty. He believed the Hills had experienced something genuinely traumatic en route 3, something that had created lasting psychological symptoms requiring therapeutic intervention, but he remained skeptical about the literal truth of alien abduction, viewing their recovered memories as psychologically meaningful narratives rather than historical facts. Simon's dilemma extended beyond the Hills' individual case to broader questions about the nature of memory, consciousness, and therapeutic responsibility. If hypnotically recovered memories weren't reliable historical records, how should therapists handle patients who developed absolute certainty about their authenticity? What obligation did mental health professionals have to challenge their patients' interpretations of therapeutic experiences? The psychiatrist lived with these questions for the rest of his career, knowing that his careful documentation of the Hills sessions would outlive his own ability to interpret their meaning. He had provided them with effective treatment for genuine psychological distress, but in doing so, he had also created the foundation for what would become America's most influential alien abduction story. Whether that represented successful therapy or unintended mythology, Simon was never entirely certain. The Hills' transformation from private citizens seeking therapeutic help to unwilling celebrities began with a single phone call on October 25, 1965. John Luttrell, a reporter for the Boston Herald Traveler, had somehow obtained information about their hypnosis sessions with Dr. Simon, though the exact source of his tip remained mysterious. His front-page article the next day, headlined UFO Chiller, "Did They Seize Couple?" would forever change their quiet lives in Portsmouth. Betty and Barney were completely unprepared for the media explosion that followed. They had shared their story only with a small circle of trusted friends, their church congregation, and a few UFO researchers who had contacted them after their Air Force report became known in investigative circles. The idea that their most private trauma would become fodder for sensational newspaper coverage was horrifying to both of them, but particularly to Barney, whose natural inclination was toward privacy and dignity. The Herald Traveler article was picked up by United Press International within hours, catapulting their story into newspapers across the country and around the world. Suddenly, the Hills found themselves at the center of an international media frenzy, fielding phone calls from reporters, documentary filmmakers, and curiosity seekers who wanted to hear about their alleged alien encounter firsthand. The timing was culturally significant. America in 1965 was primed for this story in ways that wouldn't have been true just a few years earlier. The space race was in full swing, making the possibility of extraterrestrial life seem not just plausible but inevitable. The civil rights movement had established the Hills as credible figures fighting for important social causes, lending weight to their claims about an extraordinary personal experience. The broader cultural upheaval of the 1960s had created an atmosphere of questioning traditional authority and embracing alternative explanations for reality. Young Americans were increasingly skeptical of government pronouncements and institutional wisdom, making them receptive to accounts that challenged official denials of UFO phenomena. Into this cultural moment stepped John G. Fuller, a respected New England author known for his carefully researched nonfiction works. Fuller had covered aviation and technology for years, writing for publications like the Saturday Review, and he approached the Hills story with the methodical investigation it deserved, rather than the sensationalism it often received. Fuller's initial contact with the Hills came through intermediaries in the UFO research community, who recognized that their story needed more serious treatment than newspaper headlines could provide. His proposal was both ambitious and respectful. He would write a comprehensive book about their experience, but only with their full cooperation and Dr. Simon's agreement to provide the hypnosis transcripts for analysis. The negotiations were delicate and extended over several months. Barney remained deeply reluctant about any form of publicity, concerned about the impact on their privacy and the potential for ridicule or exploitation. Betty was more open to sharing their story, motivated by the hope that publicity might help them connect with others who had similar experiences and advance scientific understanding of UFO phenomena. Dr. Simon's participation was crucial to the project's credibility. His reputation as a serious medical professional would lend scientific weight to what might otherwise be dismissed as fantasy or fabrication. But Simon insisted that any book must present their story as a psychological case study rather than proof of alien contact, emphasizing the therapeutic rather than evidential aspects of their recovered memories. The writing process required unprecedented cooperation between author, subjects, and therapist. Fuller spent hundreds of hours interviewing the Hills, cross-referencing their conscious recollections with their hypnotically recovered memories, investigating the physical evidence from their encounter, and consulting with experts in fields ranging from astronomy to psychology. The result was The Interrupted Journey, 2 Lost Hours Aboard a Flying Saucer, published by Dial Press in 1966. Fuller's approach was deliberately measured and objective, presenting the Hills account in meticulous detail, while allowing readers to draw their own conclusions about its literal truth. The book included extensive excerpts from the hypnosis sessions, Betty's drawings of the beings and their craft, maps of their route through the White Mountains, and expert commentary on various aspects of their claims. The book's impact was immediate and profound. It became a bestseller within weeks of publication, remaining on various bestseller lists for months. Excerpts were serialized in Look magazine, reaching millions of additional readers who might not have purchased the book itself. The Hills' story was suddenly part of American popular culture, referenced in conversations, analyzed in editorials, and debated in academic circles. For Betty and Barney personally, the book's success was both validating and overwhelming. They had hoped their story would encourage other witnesses to come forward and contribute to scientific understanding of UFO phenomena. In this, they were remarkably successful. Letters poured in from around the world, describing similar experiences of missing time, strange lights, and recovered memories of alien contact. But the attention also came with significant costs. Their quiet life in Portsmouth became impossible, as reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers sought them out for interviews, photographs, and personal appearances. Barney, in particular, struggled with the loss of privacy and the constant pressure to discuss the most traumatic experience of his life, with strangers who often approached their story with skepticism or sensationalism. The Hills found themselves thrust into roles they had never sought: spokespeople for the reality of UFO contact, symbols of credible witness testimony, pioneers of a new form of human experience. Betty adapted to this role more readily than Barney, discovering a talent for public speaking and a genuine enthusiasm for UFO research that would define the rest of her life. The cultural impact of their story extended far beyond the UFO research community. The Interrupted Journey established the template for virtually every alien abduction account that would follow: gray-skinned beings with large eyes, silent spacecraft, medical examinations, missing time, and recovered memories through hypnosis. These elements became so standardized that deviation from the Hills pattern became noteworthy rather than the norm. Scientists and skeptics responded with the expected mix of fascination and criticism. Some praised Fuller's careful documentation and the Hills' apparent sincerity, while others dismissed the entire account as elaborate fantasy or psychological delusion. The debate that began with the book's publication continues to this day, with no definitive resolution in sight. Perhaps most significantly, the Hills' story arrived at a crucial moment in American culture, when traditional sources of authority were being questioned and alternative explanations for reality were gaining mainstream acceptance. Their account provided a framework for processing feelings of powerlessness, technological anxiety, and uncertainty about humanity's place in an increasingly complex universe. The quiet couple who had simply wanted to understand their missing time had accidentally created one of the most influential myths of the modern era, reshaping how an entire culture thought about the possibility of contact with non-human intelligence. The years following the publication of The Interrupted Journey should have brought Barney Hill a sense of validation and closure. Instead, they marked the beginning of a slow, tragic decline that would ultimately claim his life at the age of just 46. The man who had survived World War II, built a successful career in civil rights activism, and courageously shared his impossible story with the world, found himself crushed under pressures that no previous human experience had prepared him to handle. The physical symptoms that had first appeared after their 1961 encounter continued to worsen, despite the successful hypnotherapy with Dr. Simon. Barney's ulcers, which had been manageable before their Mountain Road experience, now flared with increasing frequency and severity, requiring stronger medications and strict dietary restrictions that affected his work performance and quality of life. His blood pressure climbed to dangerous levels despite multiple medications and lifestyle changes. The mysterious ring of warts that had appeared around his groin after their encounter had been surgically removed. But their psychological impact lingered like a brand carved into his flesh, a permanent reminder of experiences he could never fully understand or escape. More troubling were the anxiety attacks that struck without warning, sometimes in the middle of his night shift at the Boston post office. These episodes would leave him trembling and disoriented, struggling to maintain the professional composure that had always been one of his greatest strengths. The unwanted celebrity that came with their story's publication added layers of stress that compounded his existing health problems. Barney had always been a private person, someone who handled personal matters within the close circle of family and trusted friends. The idea of discussing his most traumatic memories with reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers was deeply disturbing to him, yet the demands for interviews and public appearances seemed endless. Being one of the few prominent black figures in UFO research circles created additional pressures. The predominantly white UFO community often treated him as a novelty, someone whose presence validated their movement's claims to respectability and credibility. But Barney understood that his race made him more vulnerable to ridicule and dismissal, that skeptics could dismiss his testimony as the delusions of an unreliable witness in ways that wouldn't apply to white middle-class professionals. The intersection of racial stress and extraterrestrial trauma created a unique psychological burden that few people could understand or help him process. Some researchers have suggested that the alien abduction narrative provided a framework for expressing anxieties about otherness and powerlessness that had no other acceptable outlet in 1960s America. The beings who had studied him with clinical detachment mirrored the institutional racism that reduced African Americans to sociological specimens, rather than recognizing their full humanity. His work with the NAACP continued throughout these difficult years, providing some measure of purpose and dignity that helped balance the chaos surrounding their UFO experience. As legal redress officer for the Portsmouth chapter, Barney quietly tested anti-discrimination laws by arranging for black men to seek service at establishments that had histories of racial exclusion. When 4 of 9 barbershops refused service to his volunteers, Barney documented the violations and pursued legal action with the same methodical determination he brought to all his civil rights work. But even his activism was overshadowed by the alien encounter story. Reporters who came to interview him about UFOs rarely showed interest in his decades of civil rights work or his ongoing efforts to combat discrimination in New Hampshire. His identity as a community leader and social justice advocate was subsumed into his role as America's first alleged alien abductee, reducing a complex, accomplished man to a single extraordinary experience. The strain on his marriage with Betty was subtle but persistent. She had embraced their public role with enthusiasm, discovering a talent for speaking about their experience and a genuine passion for UFO research that would define the rest of her life. Her certainty about what had happened to them never wavered, and she found validation in the attention their story received from researchers and believers around the world. Barney's relationship with their experience was more complicated. While he never publicly doubted the reality of what they had undergone, he occasionally expressed private reservations about details of their recovered memories and frustration with the way their story had been interpreted by others. He wanted to move beyond that night in 1961 to reclaim some measure of normal life, but found himself forever defined by 2 hours he may never have fully understood. His health continued deteriorating through the late 1960s. The combination of work, stress, long commutes, ongoing health problems, and the psychological pressure of unwanted celebrity took an increasingly visible toll. Friends and family watched with growing concern as the vibrant, confident man they had known seemed to shrink under burdens that no one else could fully comprehend. The end came suddenly on February 25, 1969. Barney suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at home, dying before medical help could arrive. He was just 46 years old, leaving behind a grieving widow and a legacy far more complex than the alien abduction story that had made him famous. Medical experts could point to specific causes for his death: the high blood pressure, the chronic stress, the accumulated wear of years of health problems. But those closest to Barney understood that his death represented the cumulative toll of being forced to carry an impossible burden, of becoming a symbol rather than being allowed to remain a human being. His funeral was attended by friends from throughout New Hampshire's civil rights community, people who had worked alongside him for years in the quiet struggle for racial justice. They mourned not just the man who had claimed to encounter aliens, but the dedicated activist who had spent his life fighting for dignity and equality in more conventional but equally important ways. Barney Hill's death marked the end of the original witness team to America's most famous alien encounter. His voice, always more reluctant than Betty's, was silenced just as the abduction phenomenon was beginning to explode across American culture. The questions he might have answered, the doubts he might have expressed, the evolution of his understanding, all were lost with his passing, leaving Betty to carry their extraordinary story alone into an uncertain future. Betty Hill's life entered a new chapter after Barney's death in February of 1969, though she could never have predicted that widowhood would transform her from reluctant witness into one of the most recognizable figures in UFO research. At 49, she found herself the sole guardian of America's most famous alien encounter story, with a choice to make: retreat into private grief or continue the quest for understanding that had consumed their marriage. She chose to continue searching for answers, driven by the same intellectual curiosity that had led her to ask the alien leader about their star map during her alleged abduction 8 years earlier. But now she pursued this mission alone, without Barney's steadying presence or his occasional expressions of doubt that had provided balance to her unwavering certainty about their experience. Betty's approach to UFO research was methodical and systematic, reflecting her professional background in social work, where careful documentation and cross-referencing of cases were essential skills. She maintained detailed files on sightings reported throughout New Hampshire, corresponded with researchers worldwide, and investigated accounts that seemed to parallel her own experience with rigorous attention to detail. Her home in Portsmouth became an informal headquarters for New England UFO research, with filing cabinets full of witness reports, photographs of alleged spacecraft, and scientific papers attempting to explain various aspects of the phenomenon. Betty treated each case with the same careful analysis she had once brought to child welfare investigations, looking for patterns and consistencies that might validate or expand understanding of non-human contact. The celebrity status that had made Barney so uncomfortable became a tool that Betty wielded effectively in service of her research mission. She spoke at conferences across the country, sharing the platform with scientists, researchers, and other witnesses who had experienced encounters with unknown phenomena. Her presentations were notable for their lack of sensationalism, focusing on factual details and encouraging scientific investigation rather than promoting belief or evangelizing for any particular interpretation. But Betty's fame also attracted criticism and skepticism that she had to navigate with considerable skill. Debunkers questioned her later UFO sightings, suggesting that her celebrity status made her psychologically invested in maintaining her identity as an experiencer. Some researchers worried that her prominence encouraged copycat accounts from people seeking similar attention or validation. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Betty reported numerous additional UFO sightings, often in the same White Mountain area where her original encounter had occurred. She photographed distant lights that she believed represented ongoing surveillance or research activities, though skeptics pointed out that her images showed nothing more than conventional aircraft or atmospheric phenomena captured at extreme distances. Betty herself acknowledged that not all of her later sightings necessarily represented the same type of close encounter she and Barney had experienced in 1961. She distinguished carefully between different categories of observation, maintaining scientific caution, even as she remained convinced that some form of ongoing contact was taking place in the New Hampshire mountains. Her collaboration with nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, beginning in the 1990s, brought new scientific rigor to investigation of her original case. Friedman's background in nuclear physics and his methodical approach to UFO research provided the kind of credible academic analysis that Betty had always hoped there. Together, they re-examined every aspect of the Hills' experience, from the physical traces to the astronomical implications of the star map. Betty's work with her niece, Kathleen Marden, represented another important phase of her research efforts. Marden brought family perspective, academic training, and fresh investigative skills to bear on the case that had defined Betty's life. Their collaboration resulted in new interviews with surviving witnesses, analysis of previously overlooked evidence, and systematic debunking of various skeptical theories that had been proposed over the years. The evolution of Betty's public role reflected broader changes in how American culture processed extraordinary claims and unusual experiences. She became a bridge between the early UFO research community of the 1950s and 60s, which was dominated by military personnel and aerospace professionals, and the more diverse, psychologically oriented field that emerged in later decades. Betty's influence on subsequent UFO research was profound and lasting. Her willingness to discuss intimate details of her alleged medical examination established precedents for how other witnesses would describe similar experiences. Her emphasis on the scientific aspects of alien contact, rather than its spiritual or religious implications, helped shape public perception of UFO phenomena as subjects worthy of serious investigation rather than mere entertainment. Her personal life beyond UFO research remained rich and fulfilling despite Barney's absence. She maintained close relationships with family and friends, continued her social work career until retirement, and refused to let the alien encounter story define her entire existence. Friends remembered her as someone who could discuss her extraordinary experience with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to describe a trip to the grocery store, never allowing it to overshadow her identity as a multifaceted human being. Betty's relationship with the truth remained complex throughout her later years. She never wavered in her certainty about the 1961 encounter with Barney, maintaining until her death that their recovered memories represented genuine contact with non-human intelligence. But she was more cautious about her later experiences, acknowledging that proof remained elusive and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Her influence on popular culture extended far beyond UFO research circles. The beings she and Barney described became the template for countless science fiction movies, television shows, and novels. The gray aliens with large wraparound eyes that populated American entertainment were directly descended from the creatures Betty had first described under hypnosis in 1964. As she aged, Betty became increasingly focused on legacy and documentation rather than active investigation. She donated her extensive files, photographs, and recordings to the University of New Hampshire, ensuring that future researchers would have access to original materials from the case that had launched modern alien abduction research. Her cooperation with serious investigators continued, even as she became more selective about public appearances and media interviews. Betty Hill's death from lung cancer in October of 2004 marked the end of an era in UFO research. She was 85 years old and had spent more than 4 decades as the public face of alien encounter phenomena. Her passing closed the book on direct testimony from the original witnesses to America's first widely publicized alien abduction. The questions that had driven her research for so many years remained unanswered at her death. No definitive proof of extraterrestrial contact had emerged. No scientific consensus had formed around the reality of alien visitation. But Betty's methodical, dignified approach to these mysteries had helped establish frameworks for investigating extraordinary claims that continue to influence researchers today. Her legacy extends beyond the specific details of her alleged encounter to broader questions about how society processes experiences that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Betty Hill's lifelong quest for answers reminds us that the greatest mysteries aren't always the ones we solve, but the ones that keep us searching for truth in a universe far stranger than we dare imagine. The statistical evidence of Betty and Barney Hill's cultural impact is staggering and undeniable. In the 2 years following the broadcast of the UFO incident, the 1975 television movie based on their experience, reported alien abductions in the United States increased by an astounding 2,500%. What had been isolated, often unreported experiences suddenly became a recognized phenomenon with established patterns, shared characteristics, and common terminology directly traceable to the Hills' pioneering account. The archetypal elements they established through their recovered memories became the standard narrative structure for virtually every abduction account that followed. Gray-skinned beings with enormous wraparound eyes, silent disc-shaped craft, medical examinations conducted with incomprehensible technology, periods of missing time recovered through hypnotic regression. These components became so deeply embedded in American culture that deviation from the Hills template became more noteworthy than conformity to it. Hollywood embraced these elements with enthusiasm that continues to this day. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind drew direct inspiration from the Hill's description of the beings, though he chose to portray them as benevolent rather than clinically detached. The Alien movie franchise explicitly referenced Zeta Reticuli as the xenomorph's system of origin, cementing the astronomical connection that amateur researcher Marjorie Fish had proposed based on Betty's star map testimony. Television series from The X-Files to countless documentaries have recycled imagery and themes that originated in Dr. Simon's Boston office during those crucial hypnosis sessions in 1964. The Hill's experience provided the visual vocabulary and conceptual framework that defined how popular culture would imagine extraterrestrial contact for generations too. But the Hill's influence extended far beyond entertainment into the realm of serious research and psychological investigation. Their case became the foundation upon which researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs built elaborate theories about systematic alien programs involving human subjects. The medical examinations that Betty and Barney described evolved into complex hypotheses about genetic experimentation, hybrid breeding programs, and multi-generational family involvement in alien research projects. The psychological and sociological implications of their story resonated through American culture in ways that transcended the UFO research community. Their account provided a framework for processing trauma, feelings of powerlessness, and anxieties about technological change that seemed to address fundamental human concerns about control, identity, and meaning in an increasingly complex world. The abduction narrative that emerged from their experience offered a modern mythology that addressed ancient fears about the unknown and uncontrollable, while incorporating contemporary anxieties about medical procedures, government secrecy, and technological advancement. The beings they described represented the ultimate other, intelligent but alien, powerful but mysterious, scientifically advanced but emotionally incomprehensible. Gender and racial dimensions of their story added layers of meaning that researchers continue to explore decades later. Betty Hill emerged as a strong female voice in a predominantly male field, her intellectual curiosity and scientific approach challenging traditional gender expectations about how women should respond to traumatic experiences. Her active engagement with her captors, her questions about their origins and purposes, established a template for female abductees that emphasized agency and intelligence rather than passive victimization. Barney Hill's experience as perhaps the only prominent black figure in early UFO culture complicated and enriched the narrative in ways that weren't fully recognized until years later. Some researchers have suggested that his account reflected not just individual trauma, systematic study of marginalized populations, and the feeling of being reduced to specimens for scientific observation, experiences that resonated deeply with the African American experience in mid-20th century America. The scientific response to their case pushed researchers to develop more rigorous protocols for investigating extraordinary claims. The Hills' story highlighted the challenges of studying unrepeatable, subjective experiences using conventional scientific methodology. Their case became a template for how to document witness testimony, analyze physical evidence, and maintain investigative objectivity when dealing with phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The emergence of more sophisticated psychological research into memory, trauma, and suggestion was partly driven by questions raised by the Hills' recovered memories. Their case contributed to ongoing debates about the reliability of hypnotically enhanced recall, the nature of false memory syndrome, and the relationship between individual psychology and cultural narrative in shaping how people interpret unusual experiences. The believers versus skeptics divide that continues to characterize UFO research crystallized around the Hills' story, with their case serving as a perpetual litmus test for attitudes toward extraordinary claims. Believers point to the consistency of their separate accounts, the emotional authenticity of their responses, and details that seemed beyond their conscious knowledge as evidence for the reality of their experience. Skeptics emphasize the lack of definitive physical proof, the potential for false memory creation through hypnosis, and cultural factors that might have influenced their interpretation of ambiguous events. The broader implications of their story for how society processes unexplained experiences continue to resonate in fields ranging from psychology to anthropology to religious studies. The Hill's case represents a fascinating intersection of individual trauma, cultural narrative, and claims about objective reality that challenges simple categorization as either truth or fiction. Their influence on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence has been both positive and problematic. On one hand, their story helped generate public interest in the possibility of contact with non-human intelligence, contributing to support for scientific programs like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. On the other hand, the abduction narrative they established may have created cultural expectations that complicate serious scientific investigation of unusual phenomena. The transformation of their private trauma into public mythology raises important questions about the relationship between personal experience and cultural meaning. The Hills never sought fame or attention, yet their story became one of the most influential myths of the modern era, reshaping how an entire culture thinks about humanity's place in the cosmos. More than 60 years after their encounter on Route 3, the Hills' legacy continues to evolve as new generations discover their story through books, documentaries, and popular entertainment. Their experience remains a touchstone for anyone grappling with questions about the nature of reality, the reliability of memory, and the possibility that human understanding of the universe is far more limited than we dare admit. Whether their story represents evidence of genuine extraterrestrial contact or one of the most compelling false memory cases in psychological literature, its cultural impact is undeniable. Betty and Barney Hill changed how humanity thinks about its relationship with the unknown, creating a framework for processing extraordinary experiences that continues to influence witnesses, researchers, and skeptics around the world. More than 6 decades have passed since Betty and Barney Hill claimed to experience those 2 missing hours on a lonely New Hampshire mountain road. Yet the fundamental question that has driven countless investigations, debates, and sleepless nights remains stubbornly unanswered. What really happened to them on the night of September 19th through 20th, 1961? The various explanations that have been proposed over the years each carry their own compelling logic and troubling weaknesses. The literal interpretation that they were actually abducted by extraterrestrial beings and subjected to medical examination aboard an alien spacecraft is supported by the nascent satellite. Remarkable consistency of their separately recovered memories, the emotional authenticity of their hypnotic sessions, the physical traces discovered on their car and clothing, and the apparent astronomical accuracy of Betty's star map as originally interpreted by Marjorie Fish. Yet this explanation requires accepting the existence of non-human intelligence capable of interstellar travel, systematic study of human beings, and technology so advanced that it leaves virtually no definitive physical evidence. The implications are staggering, that we are not alone in the universe, that other civilizations are actively studying our species, that our understanding of physics and biology may be fundamentally incomplete. The psychological interpretation offers a more conventional framework, suggesting that the Hills experienced something genuinely traumatic, perhaps a close encounter with unusual military aircraft or atmospheric phenomena, but that their minds constructed the abduction narrative as a way of processing incomprehensible experience. Dr. Simon's original theory that Betty's recurring dreams gradually contaminated Barney's memories through repeated discussion and shared anxiety provides a plausible mechanism for how 2 people might develop consistent false memories about extraordinary events. This explanation aligns with established understanding of how trauma affects memory and consciousness, how hypnosis can create false recollections as easily as recover genuine ones, and how cultural expectations can shape the interpretation of ambiguous experiences. It requires no violation of known physical laws or expansion of our understanding of reality beyond current scientific consensus. The sociological interpretation adds another layer of complexity, suggesting that their story reflects the particular pressures and anxieties of being an interracial couple in 1960s America. The alien encounter narrative becomes a metaphor for otherness, powerlessness, and the experience of being studied or judged by hostile forces that dominated their daily lives in ways that white Americans rarely had to consider. The gray beings, with their clinical detachment, represent the institutional racism that reduced African Americans to sociological specimens rather than recognizing their full humanity. The medical examinations mirror the systematic dehumanization that racial minorities face throughout American society. The missing time reflects the psychological dissociation that marginalized people often experience when confronting overwhelming social pressures. The skeptical interpretation dismisses the entire abduction narrative as misidentification of conventional aircraft, combined with false memories created through the hypnotic process itself. Proponents point out that the White Mountains region was home to numerous military installations conducting experimental aircraft tests, that the Hill's initial sighting could easily have been a high-altitude bomber or reconnaissance plane, and that their subsequent construction of an elaborate abduction scenario followed predictable patterns of fantasy elaboration and social reinforcement. This explanation requires no extraordinary assumptions about alien visitation, false memory syndrome, or psychological symbolism. It treats the Hills as sincere but mistaken witnesses whose experience was transformed into mythology through a combination of media attention, therapeutic suggestion, and cultural expectation. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for all aspects of the Hills' experience. The literal interpretation struggles with the lack of definitive physical evidence and the violation of known physics that interstellar travel would require. The psychological interpretation can't easily explain the specific details that seemed beyond the Hills' conscious knowledge, or the precise astronomical correlations that initially appeared to validate Betty's star map. The sociological interpretation, while intellectually compelling, may impose contemporary analytical frameworks on experience that had more straightforward explanations. The skeptical interpretation dismisses too much genuine strangeness in favor of conventional explanations that don't quite fit the available evidence. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we simply don't know what happened to Betty and Barney Hill, and that our inability to reach definitive conclusions reveals as much about the limits of human knowledge as it does about the nature of their experience. Some questions may be fundamentally unanswerable, using the investigative tools and conceptual frameworks currently available to us. The Hills story continues to matter not because it provides clear answers about extraterrestrial visitation, but because it illuminates eternal human questions about consciousness, memory, the nature of reality, and our place in a universe whose true dimensions remain largely mysterious. Their experience challenges us to remain both open to extraordinary possibilities and rigorous in our demand for evidence. The case reveals the complex relationship between individual experience and cultural meaning, showing how personal trauma can become public mythology and how subjective truth can influence objective investigation. It demonstrates the difficulty of studying unrepeatable, subjective experiences using scientific methods designed for reproducible phenomena. Most fundamentally, the Hills story reminds us that human understanding of reality is provisional and incomplete. In a universe containing billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, many presumably hosting planets capable of supporting life, the possibility of non-human intelligence seems not just plausible, but probable. Whether any such intelligence has visited Earth, and whether Betty and Barney Hill encountered representatives of such a civilization, remains an open question. The enduring fascination with their story suggests that it addresses something deeper than curiosity about alien visitation. It speaks to fundamental human needs: to understand our place in the cosmos, to find meaning in suffering, to believe that we are not alone in an indifferent universe, to hope that intelligence and purpose exist beyond the boundaries of our small world. 63 years later, as we stand on the threshold of potentially discovering life elsewhere in the universe through increasingly sophisticated astronomical observations, the Hills experience seems both more plausible and more mysterious than ever. Whether they encountered visitors from Zeta Reticuli or from the depths of their own traumatized psyches, their story continues to challenge us to remain curious, skeptical, and wonder-struck by the vast mysteries that surround our brief existence on this small blue planet, spinning through the cosmic dark. In the end, perhaps the most important question isn't what happened to Betty and Barney Hill, but what their story reveals about the human capacity for both transcendent experience and elaborate self-deception, and our eternal struggle to distinguish between the two. So here we are, more than 6 decades later, still asking the same questions that haunted the Hills. Were they telling the truth? Did something extraordinary happen on that lonely mountain road? Or does their story reveal something deeper about the human need to find meaning in the unexplained? The government files remain largely classified. The star map continues to intrigue astronomers, and somewhere in the White Mountains, a historical marker now stands where it all began, a quiet acknowledgement that some mysteries refuse to stay buried. What do you think happened to Betty and Barney Hill? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into America's first alien abduction, you might want to explore our investigation into the Phoenix Lights incident, another case where hundreds of witnesses saw something that officially never happened. Until next time, keep looking up.